We're live. It's another episode of Budget Podcast. My name is Nancy Odimegu. Good to have you join us as always. So for today's episode here, we'll be discussing education funding in Nigeria, issues and options for improvement. And to delve into this topic, I'm not alone. I have with me the head of Open Government and Institutional Partnership in the person of Tolu Tope Agunloye. And I also have the team lead, Edu Planner, Oriyomi Ugunwale. Oriyomi, Tolu, how are you guys?
Yeah, I'm
fine.
And you?
I'm all right. So Nigeria's education has been here and there. In the last 20 years, the system of education has been deteriorating and has not functioned at its optimal level now due to lack of adequate funding. Now, one can arguably say that funding is one of the biggest problems in Nigeria's education system, but many people they only hear it, but they cannot contextualize it. So let's have Tolu on this one. Tolu, can you please give us a brief context around allocations and disbursements to Nigeria's education system, especially within the last 5 years?
So this has to do with data, and in order for us to have a big understanding of what has been budgeted to the education sector, whether we decide to add UBEC funds or we take out UBEC funds, we'll discover that the allocation to the education sector over the last 5 years is still within 8 to 6%. So we haven't yet hit that double figure yet. So in 2015, the total allocation to the education sector was 483.1 billion. And the total budget size that we had for the federal government budget was 4.49 trillion. Now, if you do that math, you discover that you're still having somewhere around maybe 8% and the likes. But if you decide to add UBEC funds to it, then we are eating 10.8%. For 2016, 480.2 billion was allocated to the education with a budget size of 6.07 trillion. That is 7.9%. 2017, we had 454.6 billion, while the budget size is 7.29 trillion. And if you do the percentage allocation, that's 6.2. Now in 2018, the figure kept on dropping and on and on and on up to 2021, where for the approved budget, we are having 771.46 billion with a total budget size of 13.58 trillion. Now, if you do the percentage allocation, you're getting 5.68%. Now, those wonderful figures shows that, okay, yes, there might be an increase because right from 2015, you had maybe 483, but come to 2021, you had an allocation of 771.4 billion to the education sector. However, the percentage shows that it is dropping because what you're measuring against is the total budget size. And the total budget size is also increasing. And then you discover that little amounts is really going to the education sector. Now, in terms of releases, the recurrent might not be where we need to focus our attention at, because whether we like it or not, whether we have a budget passed or approved, the recurrent has to keep on running. But our attention would go straight right to the capital allocation. So in 2015, the capital allocation to the education sector was 23.52. What was released was 13.83, right? And what was utilized was 13.03. So we still had a difference of 796 million naira in terms of between what was released and what was utilized. In 2016, 35.4 billion was the allocation to capital expenditure that's for the education sector. What was released was 22.6 billion. What was utilized was 20.8 billion. Now, if you just calculate the difference, which means we have a difference of 1.8 billion. For 2017, 56.7 billion was the allocation to the education sector in terms of capital. What was released was 33.4 billion. What was utilized was 31.6. So the difference keeps going on. 2018, where we had huge amounts, 102, but what was released was 63.02. What was utilized was 46.5 billion. So the difference shows that there is 16.5 billion naira, So you can go on, and you discover that it does not commensurate with whatever that was allocated and whatever that was released. There are lots of huge gaps between these figures. So that's where we are in terms of allocation to the education sector and the disbursements.
Thank you very much, Tolu. Now let's come to the subnational level. The responsibility of primary education falls within state government oversight, right? So let's have a real on this one. What are the issues now regarding education at the subnational level, and why do you think the state government is not doing enough? Oriyomi?
I think one of those things we can look at when it comes to education, especially in a nation like Nigeria, for a responsible nation or a responsible government, what they are supposed to be thinking of is declaring a state of emergency in the education sector. But that has not been done. And if you look at the figures Tolu has actually shared, you discover how much is still not being done yet. But in terms of improving education or increasing access to education for citizens, where we need to start from is to look at what are the needs, what do we want to address in the education sector, and we now need to do some bit of needs assessment. This is what we then guide policy formulation. After policy formulation is what you can then say how much is needed to actually implement this policy, so that you can set targets at the end of the day to say, this is what we want to achieve with this funding. With this required fund, we'll achieve this. Okay. What we've had in a nation like Nigeria is we just keep throwing money around with no specific goal. So at the end of the day that we are sharing this money, we are not planning to achieve anything, which is what is now coming back to underfunding. And you can see that from underfunding, you now see that 50% of the funds is not even being released at the end of the day. So that has put us at the state where we are in the education sector. And when you come to the subnational, which are the state governments now, and I like to say state governments feed on what the federal government is doing.
Yes.
You can play the piper at the federal level to say this is what we want to achieve. I can imagine one day if we have a government that comes into power and says, we want the education sector to be prioritized in the next 4 years. And these are the things that I want to do in my administration as a president. And it takes that initiative. There's not how it's going to continue to embark on different programs. And state governors, the subnationals, will not feed from that and say, we'll also follow suit. Do you understand now? So when you look at the federal itself, it's not doing enough. Then when you go to the subnational, you then discover there's this lethargy, there's this inability to want to do much, even in the education sector.
Let me come in here now. You earlier mentioned that the federal government may not be doing enough. But then the federal government have also provided assistance regarding education, because we have the UBEC, for example, and there's a commitment that the respective state government will have to show before they can access their UBEC funds. But then you find out that despite the availability of the funds are not being assessed by the state government. So that brings us to one question now. What is the issue, and why are the states not accessing the fund? Because that is a support from the federal government's end.
So when we look at how UBEC is 2% of the consolidated revenue fund, which is from the taxes of corporate organizations in Nigeria. That's given to UBEC to actually use to renovate schools, to do capital projects at the state level. When you look at this fund, it was supposed to be 50% support from the federal government, 50% from the states. So the states submit their proposals depending on their action plan on a yearly basis to say we want to embark on a 100 billion naira project. We need 50 billion from the federal government, who will also provide 50 billion to implement this project. That's how UBEC funding works. But you know, in a nation like Nigeria, and that's why I like the earlier question that we asked, which is about a culture of neglect towards education, which is what is also showing up here in UBEC funding. When it started, you see a lot of states came in and assessed these funds.
Yes.
By the next year, they assessed it. Not all the states came back. For like the first 4 years, 33 states were assessing it. By the fifth year, it reduced to 30 states. As at the time of 2019, 2018, you're having like 17 states.
So what's the issue? Why is it dropping?
The issue there is UBEC discovered that most state governors or state government officials now use it as racketeering. So this is what happens. They come to UBEC to say we need 100 billion. We need 50 billion from you. Who will provide 50 billion? What UBEC discovered is the 50 billion counterpart funding from state governors are actually a ruse. Do you understand? They are not actually true. So what they do is they provide this funding at the beginning to UBEC. They show it to UBEC that this is the account that I want to use for UBEC projects, and they show it to the government, to UBEC, that this is what we'll be using, and they will say, oh, this is the funding.
This is the money inside.
Exactly. So it is when CBN confirms that the money is in that account, that's when UBEC will release its own counterpart funding.
Okay.
Yeah. So, but what they now discovered along the line is once UBEC released their own fund, they pull out the fund.
The initial one that they deposited into the account.
Exactly. They pull it out, then they do some bit of short. Not even beyond that, they don't discover that these projects are not even properly implemented. So you see cases of corruption, traces of mismanagement of funds over the years. And they now see that even state governors or state government officials are not taking responsibility. So that then make them to make the process to be more stringent. They then ensure that they have to pass their checks and balances before they release these funds. And that is why you see states now start dropping out. They start dropping out.
Okay, that explains it.
A case study is Ekiti State, for example. Before now, Ekiti State was owing like I think 4, 5, 6, 7 years. Can't be specific. I know like 6 years. Do you understand? When the current governor got into office, that was one of the first things he did, which comes back to the culture of education neglect I mentioned earlier. When he got into power, he then provided a counterpart funding that made them assess the UBEC funding that they've not assessed over the years. So this is the challenge, the reason why UBEC unassessed funding keeps increasing over the years.
All right, thank you very much, Oriyomi. So let's talk about out-of-school children now and the way the number in Nigeria keeps increasing day by day. Tolu, we'll have you on this one. Now, according to UNICEF, Nigeria has about 10.5 million out-of-school children as of 2019. I mean, no doubt, this figure is like a time bomb. Any minute from now, it explodes. What does the government have to do to address this situation?
Wow. So the out-of-school children data, see, the situation is just so, as in, I'm looking for the right word to use so that at least this podcast will be friendly enough. But then, in order for us not to mind sport, I think it is just necessary for us to know that a country like ours will be having a larger percentage of the out-of-school children in the world, despite all the work that the last administration put in place in terms of, because now they decided to name the out-of-school children Almajiris. Now, the Almajiris, I know there were lots of programs that former president put in place, building of schools, even using the Islamia
Yes, Islamia,
that is,
Islamia.
yeah, they were able to do all that in order to ensure that that number reduced. But then, so far so good. Nigeria still has that huge number. Now, based on the current situation that we are facing in the country,
Mm-hmm.
insecurity, I'm sure that by the time maybe MBS or maybe they get funding and they carry out a survey, I'm sure the number would have increased. Now, because as a parent, I wouldn't want to send my child to a school knowing fully well that he or she will be
It's not
kidnapped,
safe. Yes.
Yeah. So I rather tell my child to stay at home. Aside from insecurity that we have in the country, the political will from the state government. Now, it is the responsibility of the state government to provide primary education to the citizenry. The federal government is only supporting. So the UBEC fund is an intervention fund. So state governments do not have that zeal or do not know that, oh, this is my primary function. I need to provide. And if you're not doing enough as a state governor, it simply means that you failed in your responsibility and you failed even the children that we claim that are leaders of tomorrow. Kaduna has been doing great in terms of allocation, even the capital. So when Kaduna State publishes the resources going to the education sector, capital expenditure is always higher than the recurrent, and which is really a great initiative in terms of allocation. So in maybe some states will have recurrent higher than the capital, but for Kaduna State, the capital expenditure is always higher than the recurrent, and simply shows that that is a priority of that particular governor. And so every other state needs to key into that, because the moment you show your priorities that, oh, education is one of it, and for you to even have a forward-thinking citizen or indigenous of the state, you need them to be educated, and they need to be healthy. So you need those two things. They need to be educated, they also need to be healthy. So you need to provide these basic amenities to them in order for them to be able to develop the state as you rightly want.
All right, thank you very much. So looking at public data and education, right? One of the arguments is that lack of holistic education data makes it very difficult to appraise the performance of the sector. So for Oriyomi, what do you think can be done so that government can focus more on data-driven policies in the sector?
For us to address out-of-school children, we need to know the basic data sets that guides this policy.
Yes.
I want to use to address, because that is, I like to say, when you are doing a mathematics question, for example, whatever the question that you are being asked, no matter how tedious it is, you always say is equal to. And what you have is, whatever the challenge is facing the education sector, whatever myriad, whatever form it wants to take, the is equal to in the education sector is actually out of school children. Out of school children is like the feedback that you get. Because the truth is, because I get to work on the field a lot, especially in schools, and you see parents and their kids, a community school, for example, a public school in a community, you see mothers who are going out with their children. Maybe a mother just packed to a new community, for example, and he or she is looking for a school that a child will attend. When they are going out in the evening time, around 5:30, 5 o'clock p.m. in the evening, just moving around the community, and the mother passes by a public school, for example, the mother will say, would you like to go to this school? He or she will be like, no, I don't want to go to this school. And that is the truth, because I can bet you that school will be in a state that the child will not be proud of. And one thing that I've discovered on the field is the schools in urban areas are at least to some extent very, very okay. Unlike when you move to the rural
areas, yes.
Yes, you will see schools and you cry. I remember going into a school as tall as I am. I know you've not met me before, but if you see as tall as I am, I had to bend down again
to enter inside.
Wow. To enter inside the classroom. So it's a funny scenario, and we tend to look at the education sector as this sector that we can just throw meager allocations to, and that is where we are as a nation. And that is why 10.5 million school-age children are telling us that we don't want to go to this type of schools. And that is why they would rather remain out of school than be in the classroom. And one of the truths is that is even not the true figure, but let us say that is the official data. Now, what can be done is that state government must begin to prioritize. They must begin to prioritize education in their state and say to themselves that this is what we want to do. But for them to do that, you can't just drop a policy on its own. It has to be backed up by data. And when you come to data, there's what we call the Education Management Information System, EMIS. EMIS is something that every nation should have. It's something that should be open sourced. If I want to access the EMIS for the United States, for example, I can access it. If you want to access for New York, you can access it. If you want to access for the different states, you can access it. There is no running around about it. It contains the number of classrooms, the number of teachers, the number of desks, the number of chairs, the number of instructional materials, the number of textbooks. These are data that will help you to inform, that will inform you that this is the number that is remaining. This is what we need to intervene into at this time. Okay, why don't we've tried in this aspect in the last 5 years and we've built the numbers up. Why don't we focus on this? Why don't we focus on textbooks? Why don't we focus on computers? Why don't we focus on instructional materials? These are data that will actually inform you of that. Real-time data. Is the enrollment increasing? Is the number of children who are completing classes every day, are they increasing or are they decreasing? Now that we've started school feeding program, are children going to the classrooms more? Are they learning more? Are they passing their STEM courses? Are they passing the science courses, the technology courses, their mathematics and English very well at this time? What is the factor? What caused it for it to increase? So there are a lot that data can do for you. But what you then have is Nigeria does not like data. And that is, let us just...
We don't like data or we don't have data.
We don't like data, so we don't have data because we don't even want data. We don't want data. We don't. Maybe for we in the CSO space. But when it comes to government officials, they don't want it. These are the challenges. The first challenge is we don't want data. But there's also what I now understand, because I've had to work with UBEC, have some discussions with them, and they share their challenges with me in the sense that you see that we actually wanted to get action plan from UBEC, which is central, which is at the federal level. And we said, can you give us this thing? They said, no, we cannot give it to you. You need to go to the respective states and go and ask them. Because there is now the challenges of the different types of data, the official data, the political data, the unofficial data, the real data. The data is now in segments. Yeah. So you then begin to look at those challenges that they have to face. And you want to build a central education management system that will actually inform you to take better decisions in terms of reducing things like out of school children in Nigeria. So these are the challenges, and data still needs to be improved upon, the culture, and which is something that has been done with FOI. The FOI Act, for example. Yeah. Exactly. That said that government agencies should comply with requests for data. And I will surprise you. This week I had, then let me mention this, but I had a meeting with a particular officials, education officials now. And in our discussion, because in the letter that I wrote, I quoted the FOI Act. Now they are telling me that just simply because of that chapter, that particular paragraph that I quoted, they are going to put me through the whole process that they need
before
to
you
do.
get it.
I'm telling you, before I will not get that data. That I will write letters, that this data, they can give it to me. Even unofficially, they can give it to me. But now, because I've quoted that, then they will tell me to go to this agency, go to that agency, go to that agency. I'm like, wow. So these are the challenges. Unless government can enforce it more, build better cooperation between the federal and the state level. So you don't have to. So once a data is submitted at the federal level, you don't have to go back to the state again. You can just go to the federal level and get all the data that you need and work with it. So these are things. There needs to be this harmony between the federal officials and the state government officials. Then we can begin to harmonize data in Nigeria and make better policies, even for education in Nigeria also.
All right. Thank you so much, Oriyomi. So while we wrap up this conversation, let's look at the future of Nigeria's education system, right? Now, recently, President Muhammadu Buhari, he participated in the Global Education Summit on financing global partnership for education 2021 to 2025. Now, part of the pledge that was made by the federal government during the summit was that over the next 2 years, now emphasis on the next 2 years, Nigeria would increase its funding to education by as much as 50% and proceed to 100% in another 5 years. Now, Tolu, how feasible is this now, considering the economy and the present revenue generation strength of the nation?
Some would say this is a laudable achievement, knowing fully well that Nigeria is committing to increasing the allocation to the education sector in the next 2 years. However, I know that Nigeria has been making commitments to this same sector on different platforms. So let's look at the UNESCO that says 26% of your budget, right, should be channeled towards the education sector. There is Ichion declaration that says 15 to 20% of your budget allocation should be channeled towards the education sector, you know. And now we're saying that we will increase this by 50% next year, then the second year to 100%. I just read out the releases. So it's not even about increasing or meeting all this commitment. So if you decide to say, oh, Nigeria is budgeting 26% or budgeting 40 or 50% to the education sector, is about the releases. We need revenue to be able to fund the budget. If not, they will just be mere numbers on paper. I think for me, it's about the effectiveness of these resources. How are we using the little that we've been budgeting or the little that has been released? How are we using it as a nation? Have we seen that, oh, these little resources have been utilized well? And has that reduced the out of school children? As the quality of education in the country, has it increased? Is it still high or it is low? Or the graduates that we have, are they half-baked? So we're not pushing enough resources. Whether we make a pledge of 50% today, how achievable is this?
It's our hope that federal governments make good of the promise, at least. Let's see where it takes us. But what aspect of education do you think needs additional funds right now? What are the things in the budget that are begging for projection of funds? Now let's have Oriyomi for this.
I'd like to do a background on this funding that made President Buhari to say they are going to increase allocation by 50% in the first 2 years and 100% in the next 5 years. Now, President Buhari only has one fiscal year remaining. So beyond 2022, it does not have a say in 2023 of what's going to happen. So what you have is a political statement, and it's still the same Nigeria. When we hear these things from this guy, we begin to build up hope that we should not be building up, and facts speak for themselves. The trend is there. As far as I'm concerned, President Buhari does not care about education. I like to be blunt. I don't know why. One of those things why you need to now understand the platform in which he said that. He had to fly in as the president of a nation. Most times you can send your minister of education to represent your nation at that place and give your commitment. Now, it's like UBEC funding, for example. So it is a way for developed countries to help some countries in Africa, like Nigeria, like Kenya, to see how they can support their education sector, which is called the Global Partnership for Education. So what they do is they gather African leaders together. They also gather their European counterparts, which was actually hosted by the UK Prime Minister, that's Boris Johnson. To actually see if we are going to support you, what are you going to also do as a nation? And that was what made President Buhari to come out to say that in the next 2 years is going to increase education funding by 50%. And like Tolu mentioned earlier, throughout his tenure, he has done between 6 to 8%. 6 to 8%. So where is the 50% going to come? Because when I heard that statement for the first time, like, wow, from where? So the antecedent is not there. So beyond those commitments of 2 years or 5 years, 5 years is not possible because it's not going to be in power.
It's not going to be here. Yes.
We should forget about whatever 100% they want to do. That's a politician statement. But beyond that, the developed countries actually allocated, which is the highest so far, $125 million to Nigeria in the next I think 5 years now. In the next 5 years, they're going to give $125 million to Nigeria to boost its education sector. Now, that one is sure. They will give it to us. The one that is not sure is our own commitment. But we look at one of those things we now need to look at in the education sector in Nigeria today is the areas of urgent intervention. And when you look at it, I think I like to say that school facilities represent the first thing that every child will see. And education is about social mobility. It's about the ability of nations to bring the best brains from poor background to bring them into the middle class or even into the higher class in the society. And that is one of the reasons why education is important. So if we cannot motivate children in rural communities to go into the classroom and for some 4-5 hours forget that they are from a poor background, then we are not doing enough for them. So, which is why it is important that we actually prioritize school facilities. Let us see if the federal government can embark on massive renovation of schools and not even wait for state governments for some time, because we've seen that they will sabotage the process on the long run. According to UBEC, there are 20,000 bad classrooms in Nigeria. If out of this funding, for example, the federal government can commit to maybe 5,000 schools, 5,000 classrooms, or 10,000 classrooms within this 5-year period, then it would have gone a long way to improve children motivation to remain in the classroom, which will reduce out of school children.
Yeah.
Another thing that you begin to see that is not a challenge, I like to call it artificial, but it's a challenge also, is security. Now, in terms of security, I think, for my own personal opinion, I feel like the federal government can build a central security system. I don't know how we can manage that effectively, but if we can build it to monitor school facilities across the country, if that is possible, it's something we can try our hands on. Then there's this part of, we've talked about teachers. I know Tolu tried to talk about College of Education and polytechnics, but if we can, especially at a time when we are talking about STEM education, we're also talking about STEAM. STEAM is arts into STEM. So we're talking about STEM and STEAM. How are we preparing teachers? Are we training teachers to be able to deliver this pedagogy in the classrooms? So these are these things. We need to also allocate more funding towards teachers training. Then you look at what COVID has done. COVID last year exposed a lot. For like 6 to 7 months, school-age children were at home, doing nothing. And at a point, they were doing digital learning on radio. How effective was that? So I think COVID has taught us that the federal government also needs to look at how it can develop digital learning platforms, even for public schools, to see how these platforms can be developed in case we have another pandemic like COVID-19 forever. I think it's something they can look into, even from this $125 million. Then if we can move a little bit away from basic education, we can also look at higher education and look at the recurring ASU strike that is like a yearly thing now, that ASU must go on strike every year. What if the federal government also do some bit of funding into revitalizing some of these public universities? It goes a long way. It shows good faith that the government is serious about boosting the education sector in Nigeria. And I think like these 4 or 5 areas, I don't know, more can be identified, but these 4 or 5 areas looks the ones that need urgent attention quickly, and we can use this funding for.
Okay, thank you so much, Ariyomi. Tolu, do you have anything to just wrap up with, recommendations for the next step, so that at least let's guide our federal government in the right path?
Yeah, so these funds will be coming in, yes. So without a work plan, it's going to be business as usual. So we need to ensure that any fund will be receiving from the foreign governments as donors or grants or as even maybe loan that's going to support the education sector. We need to have a proper work plan. Not just the work plan, there should be a monitoring framework that will enable CSOs, interested individuals to be able to even ensure that there is enough transparency and government is accountable to these resources that they are getting. So we know that almost everybody feels that every government is corrupt. They will still have the good ones amongst them, but the major thing is for us to ensure that in whatever we do, we should prioritize education. And the key thing again is we should invest a lot in data. The UBEC could tell you that, the number of out-of-school children is 13.5. Tomorrow they will tell you it's 10.5. We need to do our own survey. So if somebody is not funding us, can we do it ourselves in order for us to have the right data on board? How many schools do we have in the country? Public schools now. Even the private, how many private schools do we have? So that we will know the number of students in the primary school, number of students in the secondary school. Because if you don't have this data, how do you plan for them? So you want to get teaching aids. Do you know the number of teachers? How many teachers do you have in the public school? Even at the state level, does the SUBEB have all this information? Those are the things we need to spend our on, and this data should be accessible to everybody, so that we can, even if the private sector wants to fund or support the government in ensuring that the education sector is better than where it is now. Thank you.
Right, thank you. Oriyomi, briefly.
Education will work when citizens begin to demand that the government prioritize it also. And one thing we must understand is education is a cornerstone of national development. And until we can get that right, we might not get a lot of things right. So some of my recommendations, my final thoughts here is we need to begin to develop where we want to go as a nation, and education will help us to achieve that. If we can develop an action plan that points towards that. So it's important that we begin to also, as citizens, as organizations, begin to demand from the federal government that it implements an action plan, a ministerial strategic plan in the education sector. And I believe if we can implement this very well and monitor it effectively and call out their gaps wherever it is, then we would have achieved a lot to address majority of these issues that we are facing. And if we can shout about it enough, then I believe on some extent there will be commitment from the government officials.
Well, thank you so much, Uriyomi, and many thanks to you, Tolu Tokwe. Thank you. It was an interesting conversation, and I believe this is a good place to draw the curtain on this one. Well, the conversation still continues on our social media pages. On Facebook, it's at BudgetNG. On Instagram, it's also BudgetNG. Until when we see Twitter, it's also BudgetNG. My name is Nancy Odemego. Until next time, do have a wonderful day.